everybody, and welcome back to another video in our JavaScript series. So in the previous video, we briefly introduced variables and data types, but now we're going to go into a little more detail about what variables and data types are. So let me just clear out all of this code and clear out all of this. And up here, I'm just going to say variables and data types. And again, if you're just joining us and don't have the code from the previous video, basically I've got these three files over here. scil.css is empty, so we don't really need that. Index.html. All I have in here is a basic HTML template, and then down in the body, I've got this script where the source for this is linked to our script.js. And this means anytime we have the script linked down here, this script is going to run anytime, essentially anytime we load this page. So in here, all of this code should run whenever I save this. So if I hit save, you see I have this console.log variables and data types. And sure enough, over here, we see variables and data types in our log. So this is linked correctly and it is working. So if you remember from last time, let me just pull up my notepad here. If you remember from last time, I briefly mentioned about a variable, and I said a variable was like a box. And this is a box in system memory, right? So this box is named first. While in here, I can store my first name. So Tim, in this case, is my first name. And here we go. I have my first name stored inside of this box in system memory. So if I were to come back here now and actually make that in code to make a variable, I can type const, and there's other ways of doing this too. We'll get to that in a second. But I'm just going to type const for now. And if I type const first and then set this equal to, in quotes, Tim, well, now I've got my variable const first, and if I save that, you don't see anything in our log, because even though we made this variable in memory, we never actually used the variable. So if I were to come down here now and write console.log, and then let's do the backticks actually, which is going to be, this is not the single quote, don't get that confused. The backtick is the one just above the tab key and just below the escape key in the top left on your keyboard. And this is going to allow us to actually put our variables directly in our string template here. So if I say, hello, my name is, and now if I want to reference that variable, I can't just write first, because if I save that now, you see, hello, my name is first. Because this, you could tell actually even by the color being this burnt orange color, this is going to be interpreted as text. So if I want that to be actually the value that's stored in that variable, what I need to do is delete that and do $sign and then squiggly brackets. And then inside of the squiggly brackets, this $sign and squiggly brackets is telling my browser that this code, actually, this JavaScript code, or this string template inside of these squiggly brackets is actually going to be a JavaScript expression and not a string. And this JavaScript expression needs to be converted into a string because it's inside of my string template. So if I do it like that and hit save, now you can see I get, hello, my name is Tim. And I'll show you real quickly here, console.log. And in here, I can say first, comma, type of first. And this type of is going to give me the data type of my first variable. So if I hit save there, you can see I get Tim and then string. So what does that string mean? Well, basically in computers, there's different ways to store data. So just like I mentioned that my variable here, this box holds my data somewhere in memory on my computer, and the data type for this is a string, and string essentially just means text. So anytime you see string, think of this as this is text data stored inside of my memory. And the reason that we do that is text data is actually going to be stored differently than numeric data, right? Because we're going to be using ASCII codes and ASCII characters to store them into our memory, which is going to take a lot more memory than if we're just storing a number. And don't worry too much about ASCII right now. Just know that text is stored differently. So if I come down here, and if I have another box down here, and let's call this num1 for a number, and if I put 1 in here, well, let's go ahead and make that in our code and see what that data type is going to be. So if I come down here and say const num1 is equal to 1, and then if I say console.log num1 type of num1, let's go ahead and save that file, and you see I get 1 and then number. Now, if I were to come in here and put quotes around this 1 and save that again, now I get 1 in string. So even though 1 is a number, because it's inside of quotes, it's going to be saved as a string, meaning it's going to be saved as the ASCII code for the number 1 instead of actually storing the number 1 in memory. So basically, this is going to use more memory, and we don't need to do that if we're doing math operations. We want to leave it as a numeric value rather than a string value. But of course, there are cases when you need a number in a string value instead. So these are two different types of boxes that you can have. I'll also mention here that JavaScript is actually much more flexible with their numbers, with their number variable type than other programming languages like C or Java or C#. So if I come down here and let's say we have num2 and num3, and let's say this one is going to be 3.141, and which is pi, of course. And then down here, if I say num3 is going to be 10 million. So traditionally in a language like C, this could be an integer or even a short or a byte. This would have to be either a float or a double, because if you have a decimal, you have to store that in a float or a decimal data type. And then this is going to be stored in a long data type because it's 10 million. So in JavaScript, you actually don't have all of these different numeric data types. And if you don't know C or C++ or Java, then don't worry about that. Just know that these are all numbers and it works differently in other programming languages. But if I were to copy this line 2 more times, and let's make this num2 and num3, and then this is going to be type of num2 and type of num3. If I save this, you can see 1 is a number, 3.141 is also a number, and then 10 million is also just a number numeric data type, where in other programming languages, this would be like an int or maybe a short or a byte, and this would be a float or possibly a double, and this would be a long data type. So up here, these are going to be our strings, and then down here, these are going to be our numbers, and then the next data type that we're going to talk about here are our booleans. Whoops, that's not how you spell it. Booleans. And down here, in a boolean, it's essentially going to be a true or a false value. And the reason that you have these, of course, is that computers always think in Boolean logic, meaning a bit in a computer is either on or off, right? It's either 1 or 0. So Boolean is just a very logical piece of data that you can use inside of a computer program, and it makes your life a lot easier when you're comparing things and when you're checking conditions and things like that. So the way you make a Boolean is just const. Here I can say condition equal to true. So if I were to come down here and log this now, console.log, and then in here, if I write condition and then type of condition, and let's save that and look over in our log, you can see I get true, which is going to be our condition, which is what we set it to up here, and then Boolean is our type. Now, this can only have two possible values, right? So const condition 2 is equal to false. These are the only two possible values for a Boolean data type. It's true or false. So let's just copy that line, and if I say condition 2 and condition 2, we get true and false, and this is very helpful when you're checking conditions, and hence the name of my variable. When you're checking conditions and trying to make logical decisions in your program, you have to use Boolean types for that. Another thing that I'll mention is in the previous video, we talked about our our equality and our strict equality operators, right, for comparison. So if down here I say const numbers match, which is going to be the name of our variable, is equal to num1 equal. Remember, we said the triple equal sign is our strict equality operator. So now if I say num2, this actually what we're going to do here, const, we're making a constant variable. Numbers match, this is the name of our variable, so that's what we can reference that variable to. And we're assigning it with our single equal sign, or our assignment operator, to the value of this comparison right here. So num1, which is a value 1, if that equals num2, which in this case is 3.141, so if 1 equals 3.141 in both value and type, then this will return true. Otherwise, this is going to return false. Obviously, those don't match, so this will definitely return false in this case. And if I say console.log, and then if I say numbers match, and then type of numbers match, and save that, you see, sure enough, I get false. So with a Boolean data type, you can set that either to a true or a false directly, or more usefully, you can set that to a comparison of different values or comparison of different things and return either true or false based on the outcome of that comparison. The next type of data that we'll talk about here is going to be our object literals. So down here, I can say object literals. And what an object literal is essentially a list of key value pairs. So if I say const and then student grades, and if we say that this is equal to open curly brace and then a closing curly brace down here, so everything I put in between is going to be data points inside of my object literal. So if I come down here and let's say we have a student named Matthew, so I write Matthew colon, and then the grade is going to be an A. Now I put a comma after that, and then on the next line I can say we have Mark colon, and then the grade here for Mark is going to be a B minus. And basically, I can keep making student names here, and I can give them whatever grade they want. And the way that this is going to work, so I'll just do 4 here. So we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John with an A, B minus, a C, and then let's say he gets an A plus. So we have this list of students, and if I come down here, let's go ahead and log our student grades. So console.log student grades. And then also, let me just throw a type of on there as well. So student grades, type of student grades, hit Control S to save that. And you see, I get now this little drop down arrow inside of my log. And if I drop that down, I see I get John, A plus, Luke, C, Mark, B minus, and then Matthew, A. And then after that, of course, I get my type, which is an object. So here, let's say I wanted to print out only one of the students' grades. I can do that as well if I type console.log, and let's say we only care about Mark's grade, because maybe Mark is my kid and that's what I want to make sure is doing all of their homework. So I can say console.log, if I say student grades dot Mark, and then also here if I say type of student grades dot Mark. So now if I go ahead and save that, you can see I get B minus, which is only Mark's grade, and then string. So basically, this is just a list of, an object literal is a list of different values that you can have, and these don't all have to be string. I could have some of these be strings, some of these be numbers, some of these be arrays, right? Some of these could be more object literals. These could be anything that we want, any type of data that we have. And basically, this is going to be a list of different, what we call keys with the value that we're paired with. So this is just like a key value pair object, and it's very similar to a JSON file, if you know what that is. If you don't worry about that. We'll touch that later in the course. So that's what an object literal is, and that's very useful for storing collections of data that's all related to each other, rather than coming in here and saying const mark grade is equal to A, and then coming down here and saying const Luke grade is equal to B minus or B minus, whatever. Like, this is not what we want to do. That's a lot more typing, and then these will all get mixed up in our code. Whereas when we have them all together in one object, it just really helps with the organization quite a bit. So that's generally what we like to do there. I'll also mention down here another data type that we have in JavaScript is something called a null. Null, and basically a null is just going to be an empty value. So if I come down here and type const my null and set this equal to null, now if I log that in my console, I can say console.log my null and then type of my null. So let's go ahead and save that, and you see I get null and then object. So this null, you'll notice it's not in quotes. It's not even, it's gray here. It's not white like our strings were up here. This is not the same as if I were to come here and put in quotes and say null and save that. You can see now it turns white, and this is actually a string value. But in JavaScript, when I type the word null, this is a keyword, which is why it highlights it in blue. And this keyword in JavaScript essentially means that we're making this variable my null, and as of right now, we're not going to store anything inside of that null value, and that'll change later. And typically here, for example, we're using const, and I said that we would talk a little bit more about other ways to declare variables later, and now is a good time to do that, because you wouldn't generally declare a null variable. You wouldn't set a variable to null while using a const, because const, of course, stands for constant, and constant means that you can't ever change this value. So if we want a variable that we don't need yet, but we need it to be declared so that we can use it later down the road and set it to something, we need this to be changeable, not a constant value. So the way that we can actually make this changeable is, instead of using the word const, if I type let, so now now this variable, it's right now equal to null. And if I save that, you'll see there's nothing different here. But the difference, of course, is now I can change the value. So if I want to come down here and say my null is equal to 27, and then if I go ahead and actually, let me just copy this line from above. Let's move that down and then hit save. Now, if I look over here, you can see I've got my first console log of my null, which is null, and then type object. And then you've got our second console log of my null, but we've changed the value now from null to 27, and that comes back as 27 and now a number. So that's another thing in JavaScript. Some of these variables are much more flexible than in other languages. I can have this be a one type up here, and then I can change it to a 27, which makes it a number. I could even come down here and say my null is equal to, this was a null, but now it's a string. So now this is going to be a string value. And if I were to copy this again, and by the way, to copy that line, if you hold Alt and then Shift and then the down arrow, it'll go ahead and copy that line. And then if I hold Alt and then the down arrow, that will go ahead and move that line up and down. So now if you look here, if I were to save this with Control S, you can see this number was a null, but now it's, or this was a null, but now it's a string, and then of type string. So basically, I can have this be an object up here, be a number here, and be a string here. And with variables in JavaScript, you can change the type just whenever you want to. And that's something that is special in JavaScript, that if you're used to Java or C or C++ or any of those languages, this is totally different. And now inside of here, one more thing that I'll mention, you'll notice that my null is of type object. And don't worry about that. This is not an object literal like this one up here was, but this is just a kind of a historical quirk of JavaScript, and it's probably not ideal. It would be easier, obviously, if that said null, but this is just kind of how JavaScript has always been, and it doesn't look like they're going to be changing that anytime soon. So a null value, even though we're going to say that this is a data type, when you do the type of, you're actually going to get an object for a null value. But don't worry too much about that. And one more thing we'll mention down here is another data type, which is called, whoops, let me switch my keyboard back to English. This is going to be our undefined. And an undefined value is, if I were to come down here and say, let my value, and then put a semicolon, and let's try to log that. So console.log my value. So now if I were to, let's go ahead and put a type of on there as well. So type of my value, and we'll need a comma in between those. And if I save that, you can see now I get undefined, and the type is undefined. So undefined basically means it's slightly different than null, where null is, hey, we made this value, and this is empty. This is, hey, we made this value, and we just haven't, or we made this variable, and we haven't defined it yet. So you'll see this all the time if you're, particularly if you're looping through like objects and stuff. One very common place where you'll see this is if I wanted to, right, we have this object literal with all of these different students in here. Let's say I wanted to check maybe my grade. So I say console.log, and then in here, if I type student grades dot Tim, and then go ahead and save that, you can see this comes back as undefined. So any value inside of an object literal that's not defined is always going to, well, by definition, is going to be of the undefined type in JavaScript. The last type of data that we'll cover here, the last data type, is going to be our arrays. And we mentioned this last time, but I'll just briefly mention it here as well. So if I have const numbers is equal to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So essentially, this is going to be what we call an array. Anytime you put something in between square brackets, and then you have them, all these different values separated by a comma, these are going to be saved in an array. So if I were to go ahead and log that, console.log numbers, and then type of numbers. Now if I save that and look at my log, you can see that this is now, we get an array of numbers, and an array also is going to come back as type object here. But if you expand it, it says prototype and then array. And basically, an array can be used for lists of related items, just like this. The difference is, instead of having a label or a key on every one of the items, you're going to have an index. So up in our student grades, you can see we have the names of all of the students, John A, Luke C, and so on. Down here, we have 0, and then 1, 1, and then 2, and then 2, and then 3. And remember last time, I mentioned that in an array, where you have an array of numbers, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is how we count in the real world. We always start at 1. But a computer doesn't actually start counting at 1. It starts counting, or indexing rather, at 0, which is why this first one is going to be 0. The second one is going to be a 1. The third one is going to be a 2, and so on. And I will just also mention here, an array, this is all obviously the same data type, but I can actually mix up data types in my array. So if I say const my mixed type array, and if this is equal to 1, and then high, and then even I can put an object literal in here. So let's finally give Tim a grade. Maybe he got a D. And then here we go. If I were to now print this, so console.log, and then in here, if I say my mixed type array, and then type of my mixed type array, now if I hit save on that, you should see here we have our mixed type array where we have 1, high, and then our object literal in there. So if I expand that, you can see at index 0, I've got a 1. At index 1, I have a high. And at index 2, I have this object literal with Tim and then a D. I could even technically put another array inside of an array, but we don't need to do that here. That's a little more complicated than we want. So basically, these are going to be all of the different data types that we have in JavaScript that we can work with. And just think of these data types like different sizes of boxes for storing different types and different pieces of information. So hopefully this is helpful for you. If so, leave a comment down below, and we will see you in the next video.